Hey, good morning. My name is Shauna Stefanchik. I'm here with Step Up today, and we're going to be talking about moving the needle and exploring math proficiency scales. So we know with competency-based learning coming down the pike and personalized learning, this idea of proficiency scales is a hot topic for us as educators. And so that's something we wanted to offer today to walk through. How can we help support teachers and using proficiency scales to deepen and improve instruction around math? So that's what we're going to talk about today. The first thing we're going to do, though, is really talk about, before you dive into proficiency scales, just this need to make sure that you have your math priority standards paced. So we'll start with that, and then we're going to get into exploring how to use proficiency scales to build clarity. And we're specifically going to talk to using those to help build your assessments, because we're big believers in backward design. Once you have those assessments ready, you can then, have clarity to move forward with instruction. So those are the two things we're going to cover today. I'll do it pretty quickly, as I always try to keep these calls about 10 minutes for you guys, since I know you're so busy. So I love to start off with this chicken or the egg is the question for curriculum or assessment, as we get ready to talk about, as I mentioned a minute ago, we're backward design focused at our company. I love doing this activity with staff, and we'll typically have them do a value line. If you believe that curriculum comes first, stand on the left. If you believe that assessment comes first, stand on the right. And then have your teachers talk about that. And it's really interesting and a formative assessment for you. And I put the chicken and the egg because you can debate it a lot of different ways. And it's great to hear your teachers thinking around those different things and why they think curriculum or assessment should come first. But ultimately at our company, we believe assessment would come first. This is based on work from the 90s of Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe. But it's really important for teachers to understand the clarity of the standard first, and that's why we tend to go to assessment. What is the target of proficiency that we're teaching to? And then we can provide curricular activities to get there. So when it comes to curriculum or assessment, chicken or egg, our company would lean toward assessment, and we think that's how you can help leverage the idea of proficiency scales. The understanding proficiency comes before planning your activities. Otherwise, we're planning things that aren't aligned. And so we have to calibrate. This is one of the biggest things I found as a state consultant, is this misunderstanding of the Missouri standards and targets. Teachers are working extremely hard, but their understanding of proficiency is different than what the state has said is proficient. So today we'll talk about how do you even make sure that your proficiency scales are aligned to the same idea of proficiency that the state is. And so we'll show you documents you can use, because anyone can write a proficiency scale and interpret it differently or have a different idea of what proficiency is. We always want to be anchored in what the state of Missouri says. So why backward design? Because we get clarity of the standard, we get clarity of the rigor of the standard. It clarifies the question types we're going for and how we should instruct. So therefore it just clarifies instruction. And that's what our curriculum should be based around. We're going to talk a lot today, and when we recommend proficiency scales, we recommend you always start with the priority standards, and we would encourage you to be using that state list, the recommended priority standards from the state, because we know over the next few years, by 2024, 80 to 90% of our MAP and EOC assessments will be over the priority standards. So if there are any standards you're going to make proficiency scales over, make sure that they are over the priority standards. And before you start diving into scales, we want to make sure that you have a pacing guide, or that you've paced those priority standards. So this is just an example of a template, but you need to know in every unit, where do your math priority standards fall? Okay, so this would be a foundational piece. Before we make assessments, we have to know where do the standards fall throughout the year, so we know when to make an assessment. I'm going to show another example here so you can see if we have this multiplication and division. This is a third grade pacing guide. It starts in this unit. Here are the Missouri priority standards that are covered in it. Module 2, here are the Missouri priority standards that are covered in it. So one thing I want to point out, if you're using a specific resource, you can create something like this to determine when does my resource cover those major math priority standards. And I want you to notice here on module 6, this work is imperative to audit your current units and curriculum, because what you might find is there's some units that have no priorities. So on this specific one, after you get this work done, I would say, hey, switch module 7 over to 6 and 6 to the end, because you don't cover any priority standards. Look at this one. It's one priority standard and you're taking 25 days. I would probably lessen that. Anyway, we suggest kind of auditing and getting your work paced out. And then once you have that done, you're going to use this to pace, when should I create, what standards should I use on my assessments and how should they be paced? So in unit 1, when I work on my assessment, I'm going to be using my priority standards right under unit 1. Also thinking about how you do your pacing guide, we would suggest this type of format because you want to be hyperlinking your proficiency scales right to your pacing guide, so that when your teacher goes to make their assessment, what does it mean to be proficient in this? They could double click and that would come up for them. And creating a pacing guide that has a spot for student scales and teacher scales is going to be really imperative when you are forward thinking to competency-based learning. So once we have paced the priority standards, you've got to know when you're currently teaching them or when you want to teach them, because that leads, now we know what our assessment needs to be over, these 2 standards. So now let's talk about, how do we calibrate our proficiency scale? So if you're a district who's already created proficiency scales, I would just encourage you to make sure, and you probably did, that you are anchoring yourself of so your idea of proficiency is the same as the state, that you've used item specs, MOLEAT blocks, and these map released items from the DESE website to ensure that your standards stand like, and your teacher's understanding of proficiency is aligned with what the state would say. And then once you have those proficiency scales, we would encourage you to use those to build assessments. And here's assessment steps that we use. So you identify the priority standards that will be assessed, which we saw in that pacing guide. Then ours are proficiency scales are called MATs, but here you just say, then use your proficiency scale to review question sims, assessment examples from the state of what those look like. And we always say, try to write 2 to 3 questions for each priority standard from the level 3 and maybe a couple of level 2s, and then have a scoring guide on your assessments to calibrate. So if you're a district using your own proficiency scales, you can use the same process of using them to write assessments. You just replace number 2 with your own proficiency scales. So we're going to practice this using some of our scales today. So here we go. A kindergarten standard, say the number names when counting objects. Typical proficiency scales have this level 3. So you're going to think, okay, well then how are we going to assess that, right? How are we, and in kindergarten, you get the joy of doing a lot of one-on-one assessment. So what does a level 3 look like? Can the child verbally count? Can they pair each object? Can they match the numbers? Our scales have this, and if yours don't, then you could pull these documents from DESE where you've got the item specs and examples to say, you know, now you have to find assessment questions that sound like what this unwrapping looks like. So having your teachers using your unwrapped to determine, well, what is a question? And we've provided one here that could look like. Touch and count, start at 0 and count each apple. And again, they're doing this with the students. But you're pairing the priority standard and your proficiency scale to help teachers determine what types of questions do they need to ask there. Let's look at a higher level one. That one's a little confusing. I'm going to skip to. Let's look at a 3rd grade. Decompose a rectangle into smaller rectangles to find the area of the original rectangle. One activity I like to do with teachers to talk about calibration is, before you even look at map examples or other examples, have them look at the standard and just write some sample questions, and then pause and compare what they look like. There's so many interpretations to our standards and how we write those. And I think it's a really great process to see how teachers can misinterpret their standards and then come back to your proficiency scale and pull those examples like this to say, but do your questions look like, sound like these? So this specific one, it's actually giving a word problem, and how does the shaded area of her new figure compare to that of the original square? This is very much what students would see on a map type assessment. And having teachers interpret that standard and then look at a Missouri example is a really great cognitive dissonance activity, because typically we glance at the standard and think we understand it, but the rigor of how the state asks it is very different. So I'm going to pause here for a second. Val or Lindsay, any questions or comments? I feel like I'm speeding through, but this idea I think that I'm really trying to bring is, if your proficiency scales currently just have this unwrapping, you really need to try to pull in some assessment examples from the state, because that's typically what really brings clarity. Questions or thoughts about that from either of you? Trying to take pressure off of me, you two.
Well, I just want to add that like having it unwrapped and clarified means we're not interpreting it in 10 different ways. So that takes the pressure off of the teacher to try to figure out what exactly does this mean? What should the student be able to do? So that's very helpful.
Right. And I think that's one of the powerful things, and Lizzie, you could probably speak to it since your teachers have created proficiency scales, but engaging in those conversations of how would we unwrap this standard, like you see under the level 3, those are powerful conversations for teachers. You can pull your Missouri item specifications, but I don't always agree with all of those, and some grade levels are written better than others. But having your teachers engage in those conversations is really, really important. The only thing that we try to bring in with our product, and again, you can do on your own without borrowing our product, is to really, this right-hand side of providing the assessment examples, that's where we find real clarity begins, because you can still read this unwrapping and choose a question that doesn't get to this rigor. And as a consultant across the state, that's what I see all the time is we're just looking at this unwrapping and we're unintentionally teaching below that rigor to students all the time. Adversely, for those of you who use Eureka Math, that program actually goes too rigorous and doesn't help us teach enough of the basic multiplication and algorithms. And so this work is also really helpful to see, where is my series on track and where do I need to supplement more to be really aligned to Missouri. So this was really fast and furious. If your district who hasn't created proficiency scales, this wasn't for you. This was just really, if you do have those scales, how you might be using them to help your teachers create assessments and to vet those, because there's power in clarity. You know, we have this saying in our company that clarity brings confidence. So we're just saying, make sure to use those proficiency scales and take it one step further to provide clarity by making those assessments, and that you can use MOLEAT blocks, map release items, and item specs to help get these more assessment types, because that helps clarity even more. And then we do have our math scales are coming out, which we're really excited about. And we are running a special this month. If any of you are joining the call and you're thinking, man, we haven't engaged in that work, or we have, but you know, digitally we're going to use ours. Some districts who've already created them say we're going to use ours digitally, but we like having these hard copy books where we provide you K through 5 all in one stop shop, all the proficiency scales with these graphics already included. That's also an option, because at our company we feel like education has told us that teachers have to develop it, and what we found is we could develop it and just help teachers develop a process so we could expedite their learning. So there's another option for you if you're interested. And that's the end of my session today. I hope you got a few nuggets, and we thank you for your time.